Courageous Conversations was launched in 2020 in the midst of the racial reckoning following the death of George Floyd, Regis Karpinski-Paquette, in order to have conversations around difficult and contentious issues that were happening and around which we needed to increase knowledge and awareness. So, for example, around systemic racism, around racial profiling, and around efforts to come to terms with what is to be done. We found two people who inspired these kinds of conversations historically and today, one of whom is Violet King, a Calgarian who became the first Black woman lawyer, and the other was Maya Angelou, the African-American author and poet who said that courage is the most important virtue because without courage, you cannot do anything else consistently. What inspires me is having the conversations with these leading thinkers from across campus, the country, and around the world who have been thinking deeply about these issues, who have been engaged with social justice movements, with university communities, with other intellectuals and activists, with an aim not just for understanding, but also for thinking about how that understanding can be mobilized in order to affect sustainable change. Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Malinda Smith, and I'm the Vice Provost and Associate Vice President, Research for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion here at University of Calgary in the city of Calgary. It is my honor to welcome you to this first Courageous Conversation event in 2023. Courageous Conversation is a speaker series designed to spark honest, difficult, challenging, humane dialogue that we need if we as individuals, as communities, as a society, are to work together to combat injustice and to build equitable and sustainable pathways for all. In that spirit, I'd like to take the opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, the Pikunai, the Kainai, the Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nations and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley's First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. Today, we are talking about Rehearsals for Living, the title of the book, which is derived from the work of, the Rehearsals for Living, and which is co-authored by Robyn Maynard and Leanne Simpson. The title of this important work is drawn from Ruth Wilson Gilmore, in which she writes, "Life is a rehearsal because freedom is a place." And this book is intimately about freedom, dealing with unfreedom. It's also about thinking as about the ways in which, as Maynard and Simpson highlight, using language of wreckage and collapse, how do we step back, take stock, reimagine another world that is possible, a world that's unfolding in the context of a pandemic, ongoing and police brutality, what Maynard refers to as a moment in which we were forced to doom scroll the multiple crises of our time. We are in that moment. And so in that spirit, unfolded a revolutionary, inspired, intimate conversation between two activists, scholars, thinkers who drew on collective knowledges through writing, through conversations to imagine such a world and to think about how we go about enacting that. So we are honored and privileged to be able to host them today. For this session, transcription has been enabled. But before we continue with our conversation, I'd like to introduce to you Elder Sitting Eagle, who has been the elder throughout the Courageous Conversation speaker series, and we are honored and privileged to be in ongoing conversations with her, and she engages with us and our speakers. Elder Sitting Eagle is a language instructor at the Sissica Outreach School, which sits on Sissica Treaty 7 land. She is also works as a researcher, a teacher for the Blackfoot Crossing Historical Park. And in fact, that's where she's just come from teaching, and has been employed with the Sissica Cultural and Heritage Community for some time. She has traditional knowledge. She's a traditional knowledge holder and insights on ways of being and doing that are important in our journey towards ongoing reconciliation. At this time, I would like to invite Elder Sitting Eagle to start us off today with a blessing. Thank you, Elder Sitting Eagle. Good to see you.
Can everybody hear me? Everybody can hear me okay?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, today I mentioned that I do the blessing for the morning and just give a brief comment on the issues that we will be dealing with in the next few months. So I'll do my blessing. Ayo absidoki ano kamuksin no tak pokei puam tak pokei puimex. Okay, kukito just pizza man it's a better piece. Okay, tapi ko ano kamu po pishpina. Okay, tapa kayo mamuksi kapsix. Okay, ni tapi naksimix kumakitapix. Okay, kimatu samuk size chicks. Okay, just ako kito so quick ya mustin sepos and honest. Okay, the next because kideni katsumat kitek kideni katsumat abstaduki. Okay, kimatu kinana nuksistikoy. Okay, takita men one and it's kimman and next. Okay, what's my cut mo sama krististomix. Amoxaico 6. Amoxekino pics. Okay, kimato kidabstaduki. Connectico sanokam sikit kokipinanis noktais sit a piece pinan. Okay, kimato kit sami beta piece. Suxi beta piece. Okay, is the watchman. So my prayer today is to send blessings to all of you. It's kind of hard for me right now to, I guess, really give my whole heart to a lot of things like work, just daily living. I lost my only son in September. He went peacefully, just went in his sleep. He would have turned 40 in November. I was blessed with 2 children, my late son and my baby girl. I guess when we talk about the topic of today, just reading Rehearsal for Living. I guess my rehearsal for living in the last 64 years, going into my 65th year, is children are given to us on loan, not knowing that, the day will come that my son will be, taken back to the Holy Mother. But one thing that makes me feel calm and gives me the strength to go on each day, to wake up every morning without my son, is that I was born a strong Catholic and an Anglican and a Siksika way of life, meaning the religious ceremonies that I was brought up with. My late father, Mark Wolfick Sr., was a member of the holiest society here in Siksika, which is the Horn Society. And my mother just kind of, worked with him, alongside of him, not knowing that my mother also was blessed with a gift from Abasituki, creator. And today we still use her smudge in times of bad weather, when the world isn't going the way it should be. I usually light her smudge just to give me that extra strength. And going back to the strength that I've been given is through the Catholic faith, the Blessed Mother, the Virgin Mary, Mother of Guadalupe, whatever name we've given this mother, this Holy Mother, lent my son to me. 40 years ago, she lent me my son. And 40 years later, she took him back to the Holy Land. He must have been needed for something up there. Here on earth, his work is done. But he was a musician. He was an amazing guitarist, drummer. His singing, he always said that he could be better. But to me as a mother, he was, he had angelic voice that every child has and blesses us with. So what gives me the strength, and when I talk about the rehearsal, I was given a rehearsal to be a mother 40 years ago, not knowing the difficulties, the positives, the negatives that our world, whichever world we live in, meaning community, nation, country, we're all faced with many difficulties. So the day came that the Blessed Mother came to take my son back. And the reason why I find strength in that, in our Catholic faith, the Blessed Mother gave him to me. And the last song that was sung by the father, the Catholic priest at the burial, was Ave Maria. He used a harmonica and he played Ave Maria. When he started playing it, what gave me the calm for that day was the Blessed Mother took my son back. And Ave Maria shows that she sang her last song to me for lending me her son. It's kind of easier to talk about what I lost a big part of my life. And when we talk about rehearsal, the rehearsal of living, racism, addictions, everything that's happening in and around us. Here in Siksika, every week we're burying young people. Every week, alongside those young people, we're burying elders. We just buried an elder last week. And I think since September, when I lost my son, and before that, we were burying young people like every week here in Siksika, due to addictions, due to sickness that are associated with addictions. I strongly believe that the rehearsal where we've been given, we have to make the best of it. Like the life I have today, I have to make the best of it as whatever years I have here to share with my daughter, my grandchildren. I guess the biggest negative or the biggest trauma that I've been hit with is you're so used to preparing for two children all their lives. And then, to be left with one that you have to be the role model. Like in any community, any town, country, we're the role models of everything, the positives and the negatives. I always use positives and negatives as one. because we all go through that. We've all experienced many negative things. One thing I wanted to bring to the attention of the viewers is a few months on Christmas Day, 1:00 Christmas Day, a young person that was the same age as my son, his life was taken. You might have heard it on the news. He was shot 21 times by our Strathmore RCMP. And the stories there are not matching up. And we think about the father, the sister, the brother, and especially his children, young children that he left behind. A lot of people say it was in the line of duty, but we're going through, our nation is faced with that right now. So this young man's rehearsal, this young man's life was put to an end, sudden end, and a very traumatic end. And those that were on the other side of the weapon that took his life are the ones that they have to deal with it every day. But as kind-hearted, loving people that we are, we send our blessings to them and their families, because alongside us, their families will be suffering the same way that the young children of this young man are facing each and every day. So I'm not sure if I'm in the line of what we're talking about today, but like I mentioned to Tracy, I get choked up every now and then, and I'm so honored to bless you with my blessing, give you a few inspirations of what my life has been in the last 4 months. So with that, I would ask for your prayers to keep me strong. Give me the love and strength that I could see all of you again. I know it's going to get harder and harder, but it's a new life for me. I've experienced losing my parents, my brothers, my sister, my nieces and nephews.
Understand that.
But to lose a child, a person he brought into this world, I have an empty spot in my heart at this time. So I'd like to thank you for, just listening to me, and prayers will be very helpful to me and my daughter and their dad and his children. He had 2 children. So thank you.
Elder Sitting Eagle, I want to thank you for your blessing and for opening and sharing with us your story. And I know everyone on this call, on this webinar, send you their condolences and love. And thank you for the beautiful and intimate ways in which you share how what we're talking about, and that you draw attention to the rehearsal, the unscripted rehearsal, the rehearsal is our life. And the life is one, and for highlighting, I think, the ways in which the very conversations we are having about is really real and meaningful, and includes all the love and the relationships and the traumas and experiences of our lives. And so I know people will join me in sending you and your family much love and best wishes and prayers, and hold you high in their thoughts. So I want to on behalf of the Courageous Conversations Speakers Series, really extend my deep and profound thanks and appreciation to you for starting us off in this good way, as you always do. And for taking the time in the midst of everything, teaching, loss, living, rehearsing, to taking the time to always be here with us and to share your stories and to engage in these teaching, which always inform our conversation. So with this, I want to start off us this way, and I want to give you this tobacco as a thank you on behalf of Courageous Conversation. Thank you. And now the Sitting Eagle and I will be back to have a conversation with our speakers. But I would like now to turn to our first speaker of this afternoon, who will be Robyn Maynard, who is an assistant professor of Black feminism in Canada at the University of Toronto in Scarborough. Dr. Maynard is, as many of you know, the co-author with Leanne Simpson of Rehearsals for Living, but you also know she's the author of Policing Black Lives, the award-winning book. And I will come back to talking about this how it is that someone who's been had a profound impact on activism, on our intellectual engagement, on thinking the difficult and unthought questions that needed to be thought, how that the paradox of that experience for someone who does not ask that these things of these award-winning books, does not ask for them, but it receives them, and how she credits this for the collective imaginary and experiences that informs the work. She's published over a dozen book chapters and articles, which appear in all the top journals, Critical Ethnic Studies, Scholar and Feminist Online, Topia, Canadian Women's Studies, and elsewhere. Her work has had profound impact on scholarship, on bodies of knowledge, on activism, including on Black feminisms in Canada, in the United States, and around the world, on carceral studies and policing, abolition. And I think something that is extremely important in this moment, the work on Black Indigenous relations, which has been translated into French, German, and is taught widely around the world. So we will begin with a reading by Robyn, and then we will have due to last-minute scheduling issues, unforeseen circumstances, Leanne is unable to be here, but she has a video that she has shared with us. And so Robyn and Leanne will be in conversation, and then we'll all be in conversation at the end. So please let me turn the virtual floor over to Robyn Maynard.
Thank you so much, Dr. Malinda Smith, for the incredibly generous introduction. Thank you to Tracy Garrick, Lindsay Curry, Melissa McKay for the behind the scenes work that is so crucial to these events and to making all of this happen. And I want to thank as well so much from the bottom of my heart, Elder Colleen Sitting Eagle, for this beautiful opening and blessing. And I also just want to share, as a parent myself, my condolences and solidarity for your loss. I'm honored to be here virtually in Alberta as a part of this Courageous Conversations event. As Leanne and I said to one another upon receiving the invite, if Dr. Malinda Smith invites you to take part in an event, the answer is an automatic yes. We're very grateful for Dr. Smith's body of work that has made so much possible for so many Black scholars in Canada, both in terms of scholarship as well as in terms of EDI work that is so crucial to making university spaces places where liberatory thought and work can flourish and be found and seen. So today I'm going to read a little bit from Leanne and I's latest work, Rehearsals for Living, we thought that given the theme of conversations, and because Leanne can't be here, the most fitting thing would be to read from the book, which is, after all, itself a series of letters, a conversation between the two of us, written before and during the pandemic, about the possibilities of Black liberation, of Indigenous solidarity, about movements towards abolitionist futures, land back, global anti-colonial solidarities, that takes an accounting of the very local and global contours of the present conjuncture of multiple crises, a pandemic, ecological crisis, ongoing police killings and incarceration of Black and Indigenous peoples, the life-shortening impacts of the afterlives of slavery, ongoing colonialism, and genocide, some of which were highlighted by Elder Colleen Sitting Eagle. So I'll begin from the beginning. Dear Leanne, 5 years ago now, I sat down with a copy of your book, as we have always done. I'd planned to flip through the first pages over my morning coffee. In the end, though, I stayed put, reading almost the whole text in one go, and was suddenly overcome with a strong feeling that I wanted to know you. Your words beckoned me to join you in what you called constellations of co-resistance. Constellations that affirmed the world, life and world making in a time of acute racial violence. We spoke on the phone shortly after. I remember that I was in a Subway restaurant in downtown Montreal, squatting the free Wi-Fi to do a final fact check of some op-ed I'd written. I could barely make out your voice over the very loud and very bad music. I don't recall the details of what we talked about, but I know that I have wanted to chart old and new constellations with you ever since. I've been meaning to write you for a long time, and yet it's hard to know where to begin. So I guess I will start where I'm at. I can't stop doom scrolling the multiple crises of our time. At this moment, I'm preoccupied and filled with dread by the reports of rising temperatures, the just about last chances being regularly leveled by climate scientists, the continually shelved fact of the matter that things must be drastically and immediately shifted if we are to avoid what they describe as untold suffering. I'm preoccupied with what goes unwritten in so many reports, but that I know in my bones. Some communities' untold suffering will vastly exceed that experienced by others. Some communities have been facing untold suffering for multiple generations. I don't want to live in this preoccupation, in this dread that sometimes comes to visit me and threatens to immobilize. So I suppose this is me reaching out simply for a leveling of the grounds beneath my feet, for communion, to help transform the source of this dread into a place from which we can instead plot, conspire, dream, and attend to life otherwise. Talking and thinking with you has always helped me focus on the vitality, the livingness of the traditions that our work emerges from, regardless of what the last several centuries of European atrocities have wreaked on our peoples. I don't see you as much as I would like, and the phone is not my medium, so I've decided to write you this letter. I'm writing a letter even though it feels cringy because I'm shy. I'm writing you a letter even though I may never send it, even though you may never write me back. I am writing you a letter at the end of this world. From Cyclone Idai in Malawi, Mozambique, and Zimbabwe to Hurricane Dorian in the Bahamas, the devastating forest fires displacing indigenous communities from the Amazon rainforest through to the Mishkogamen Ojibwe Nation in Northwest Ontario, our respective communities, that is, Black and Indigenous communities, are collectively positioned on the very forefront of the unfolding catastrophe. Even if we didn't take into account the dramatic shifts that are occurring and will further occur with the melting of Arctic ice caps, rising seawaters and eroded shorelines, desertification and species extinction that are now nearly, but not totally inevitable, the reality is that not only are an array of world endings before us, they have already arrived. The apocalypse is imagined, after all, in most classic Euro-Western settler tropes, in terms of the lack of clean drinking water, the destructions of the places they live, the poisoning of the earth, inhumane and restrictive responses to people left hungry, displaced, in desperation. That is a condition that is already deeply familiar to our kin across Turtle Island and globally. To remix Public Enemy, Armageddon been in effect. It is the apocalypses of slavery and settler colonialism that bind our collective pasts and presents together in the calamity at hand. Today, the racially uneven environmental catastrophes of the present are inextricably connected to the unfinished catastrophes of 1492. The two genocides at the heart of the Americas, to paraphrase Eminor Bessie Phillip, when a death-making commitment to extraction and dispossession took hold on a global scale. This created a logic and political economy in which our ancestors became, through distinct and interrelated processes, what Cedric J. Robinson once described as a collection of things of convenience for use and/or eradication. As we are confronted with the crisis of the Earth's viability then, amid so many crises, I'm writing you to think about what it might mean for us to work toward building livable lives together in the wreckage. As I write you from the end of this world, I'm also very aware both of our respective, if unidentical, subject positions as domestic enemies inside the settler state and of our presence within one of the main arteries of Western Empire. I am writing to you from the belly of the beast. Despite its ongoing pretensions of being a benevolent nation state, Canada plays an important role in the massive carbon unloading and the ecological and human devastation wrought by extractive industries. These industries produce over 50% of the world's carbon emissions, not to mention the cataclysmic environmental devastation of the tar sands pipelines that run through more than 350 Indigenous nations in so-called Canada alone. Much of the unmaking of Black and Indigenous lives and the ecosystems that have historically sustained our lives, spanning Turtle Island, the Caribbean, Africa, and South and Central America, can be traced right back here. In fact, while I'm haunted by the specter of the pending crises, there is something about our sheer physical proximity to the authors of these monstrosities that is weighing heavily on me these days. Out of a mix of curiosity and compulsion, I created a Google Maps itinerary to figure out how long it would take me to travel from my house to some of the places where our collective apocalypses are being mapped out. A kind of walking tour that maps out some of the contemporary architects of the warfare against human and non-human life. As it turns out, it would take 1 hour and 12 minutes to walk from my home to the main office of James Bay Resources Limited, a Canadian company that is based in the Niger Delta region that is the homelands of the Ogoni peoples. In the Delta and across the region, gas flares resulting from oil extraction have been burning off carbon dioxide emissions that are comparable to the annual output of Sweden. It is a site of both racial and ecological destruction, mutated food crops, toxic drinking water, rainwater that melts through the tin roofs of people's homes, and a wide assortment of permanent human and non-human health crises. Of course, even as this site of transnational anti-Black violence produces flares that are visible from space, there is no discernible trace of this available at company headquarters. That would be uncivilized. Enabling Google Street View, it is clear that little evidence links the decisions made in this metropolitan office to the crimes enacted over there, a medium-rise gray building, flanked by 2 Starbucks cafes and underground parking. 9 minutes after leaving this office front, where I would see nothing and feel everything, I would arrive at the headquarters of Bellow Sun Mining Corporation. Here my street view seems to glitch, only showing me the front of a seemingly closed dollar store called Rainbow Jade, inside of what appears to be a mini mall. But honestly, this does not matter. I just know that I am likely not missing much, even as this company is set to build Brazil's largest open-faced gold mine, the Volta Grande mine, in the heart of the still-burning Amazon rainforest. You can see these fires too, from NASA cameras in space. This mine, this future abomination that is orchestrated from somewhere probably close to Rainbow Jade, will leach toxins into the lands and waters of the Indigenous Yuruna and Araya peoples. But bad news for Indigenous people is good news for colonizers everywhere. A CBC News tweet following the election of white supremacist President Jair Bolsonaro declared, "Critics have lambasted the former paratrooper for his homophobic, racist, and misogynist statements, but but his government could open up new investment opportunities for Canadian investors. Colonizer meet colonizer. It does not take great imagination to say that if I can't virtually see this building, it is probably either gray or brownish or whitish, probably tall, and I wouldn't have much time to take it in. And only 1 minute after leaving this building, whatever it really looks like, even as I've crossed a hemisphere in terms of impact, I will find myself at the last stop, the headquarters of Copper One, yet another high-rise. Currently undertaking a legal battle against the Algonquins of Barrier Lake to mine the resources on their traditional hunting grounds, Copper One is not yet dissuaded, despite years of community resistance in the form of blockades and legal challenges. Anyways, you might note that this tour starts and ends somewhat arbitrarily. It could go on all day, with more than 50% of the world's mining companies traded through the Toronto Stock Exchange. This tour of invisible carnage shows us that Toronto really is the global hub that it is so widely celebrated to be. It is on and around Bay Street that we find the direct lines between capitalist accumulation and those racial subjects whose lands and labors are being accumulated and poisoned. It also shows us that the climate crisis is not coming. For some, its arrival began long ago. All of this in 90 minutes, likely less because I'm a fast walker. I'm drawn to this walk that links Toronto and the settler nation state to the global flows of capital that emerge from the accumulation of racial and ecological assaults, largely but not exclusively on Black and Indigenous lives, both here and a multitude of elsewheres. Maybe we will walk this route together sometime. I think I would like to. But I'm not sure why I keep refreshing the browser, expecting for something more to reveal itself to me, as I look for some trace or hint of the barbarism behind the veneer. Toronto, like the Canadian society it encapsulates, has explicitly evolved to keep the violence on which it relies firmly out of view, a perfectly modern society that tidily keeps its atrocities out of plain sight. I know that I will make this pilgrimage on my own at some point, possibly before I send you this letter. I also know that I will be disappointed and then irritated with myself for being disappointed, and then devastated at the state of the world that white supremacy built. I am acutely aware that it is our collective destruction as Black peoples, as Indigenous peoples, along with the rest of the global wretched of the earth that is being drawn up in the boardrooms of global finance, and theirs and their grandchildren too, though they are too arrogant to see this. The IPCC report brings to light what is to come, previously unknown levels of fires, floods, droughts, famines, and shortages of all kinds. Faced with a planetary crisis on multiple frequencies, the state and corporate ruling classes work together to commit and recommit the planet anew to death or near death. And yet, even as the final assault on the viability of the earth is being authored on the many Bay Streets of the global north, this is being called the Anthropocene, a crisis caused by human activity that puts human life at risk. But this is an affront because it's not humans, is it? Human has never been a politically neutral category. In this anthropocentric framing of the climate crisis, it is important to ask who exactly is imagined as a human. It is not humanity that poisons so much earthly, human, and non-human life, but a small and highly powerful minority of humanity and the order they have imposed on all earthly life. The climate catastrophe was born not from mankind, but from the slave plantation, the settler town, the prison, the reservation. For this reason, it is unsurprising that the solutions being forwarded by those in power are more of the same: the border wall, the immigration detention center, the refugee camp, the open pit mine. For us to live in anything that I hope we could one day call freedom, it is necessary to put a swift end to the death drive disguised as worldview, the murderous episteme that is being imposed on us by the master, settler, CEO. All world endings are not tragic. There are some world endings I am comfortable with. In order to make earthly planetary survival possible, some versions of this world need to end. Some worlds, after all, depended on the ongoing, violent, always racial and gender differentiated foreclosures of other worlds. To avoid the worst case scenarios now predicted by global scientific consensus, it is necessary for us to have the courage to envision the end of this world, that is, the world that white supremacy built, to move toward liberatory futures that are premised on life rather than human ecological, animal, microbial waste. This disruption is what Fanon was getting at when he wrote in The Wretched of the Earth that, in his words, decolonization, which sets out to change the order of the world, is obviously a program of complete disorder. Disorder is not the same as chaos. It implies instead a radical rupture from the dominant order, which is, after all, murderous. A program of disorder implies here that we radically alter and indeed breach entirely with the current order of things and the global violences upon which this order relies. I believe that world ending and world making can occur simultaneously. Given that racial and ecological violence are interwoven and inextricable from one another, more now than ever, Black and Indigenous communities, who are globally positioned as first to die within the climate crisis, are also on the front line of world-making practices that threaten to overthrow the current death-making global episteme. Perhaps our communities, quite literally the post-apocalyptic survivors of world endings already, are best positioned to imagine what this may be. This, after all, is the radical promise, if as of yet not achieved, that was extended to us by the world-making projects of abolition and decolonization. If our histories are intimately intertwined with one another's, so too are our futures. Maybe writing together, walking together, witnessing these times together in this way will help us to forge ahead differently. And maybe it will help us to anchor ourselves and one another as we try to find a way to map out liberated futures for our children and theirs in a time when any notion of future feels unnavigable. I'm hoping, mostly in writing you, that maybe this grounding together will help remind us that anyways, we and ours have been building livable worlds to live in all along, despite and against forces aligned to steal our light, and that we will continue to do so no matter what comes our way. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robyn, for that powerful reading, which I'm looking forward to to having further conversations with you about. And in particular, I am struck by the language that you use and the way in which you tell the story at the same time. So I'm thinking of apocalypse, world changing, world making, because they may seem to present a paradox, but at the same time, at the interstices of these things, there is, I think, that the possibilities that you tease out. And so I'll be very interested in returning to think through that, the language, which actually is both provocative and disruptive at the same time, in order to imagine a world otherwise. I have your book in terms of the print, but I also got the audio book because I wanted to hear it, what it sounded like. And as I was going through the images, as I said, that came to my mind were images that you highlighted of wreckage, collapse, and apocalypse, and doomsday. But that was only a seg into something imagining a world otherwise. And I wondered if that was part of your reflection when you were thinking through this work, when you were writing these letters, which you didn't know whether you would ever share or whether how they would be received. So I wonder if you could just actually walk us a little bit through that process of this pivot from this kind of apocalyptic, but also with our rather challenging conversations, thinking through lived experiences of the afterlives, of thinking about the afterlives of slavery, of settler colonialism, and imagining freedom from this. So that's a lot. So on the one hand, but you're also thinking of movement and change. And I wonder if you could share a little bit with us about that process, that journey that you were going through when you were doing this work.
Sure. Thank you so much for that question and for that very generous engagements with, the complexities of what it means to be thinking through a world which, you know, as so many of the latest scientific reports are really telling us, that this version of the world that we have come to know of viable ecosystems are really at the brink of collapse, right? And how do we think about that in a way that continuously allows us to insist on otherwise possibilities, right? And I think it was really sitting at that generative tension that was the way that we managed, the really way that we were managing to write each other and never being able to really think of one without the other. So I think that one of the things that, you know, I think you really heard me trying to do in this first letter that I read is to really think about this notion of apocalypse differently in terms of whose worlds are we talking about ending, for example, and who's included, and what we're thinking about as a contemporary apocalypse. So something that I think is so crucial to really understand is that what Indigenous peoples went through in the context of genocide could only be understood as a kind of apocalyptic violence. What happened to the West Africans who were stolen from, who were kidnapped from the shores of West Africa, and then really brought to be worked quite literally to death in the Caribbean at the same time, right? Where they talked about, even by the 18th century, the soil in Barbados was already so degraded because it had been used so extensively. You know, the kind of world that was made in the so-called New World with the extension of slavery and settler colonialism was apocalyptic for so many of us who are not considered in terms of this we as we approach a contemporary apocalyptic moment, right? So some of us, as I'm really trying to point out, have lived through an apocalyptic moment as we're facing one in the throes in which many more people in the world, including those who have historically been able to protect themselves from and insulate themselves from the kind of violence that they've wreaked out on other populations, are now having to face as well. So I think it's really important to trace the intersections between the kind of ecological violence that happened when we look at, for example, the division of the African continent by European powers, the imposition of this kind of mode of production that has been leading us to the salinization of waters, of so much of the ecological destruction that we're facing. So I think that giving that a history and weaving together these histories of ecological violence, racial violence together really helps us to understand more the intersecting crises that we're facing right now. But something that was really important, I think, to remember for us as we were thinking together was that not only are so many contemporary Indigenous land defense moments like Wet'suwet'en on the West Coast, like the Algonquins of Barrier Lake, really struggling for land defense, but it's not only land defense in terms of ownership, as I think Leanne points out so beautifully, but it's about a different orientation to land, not based in extraction, not based in this kind of destructive mode of production that we see with racial capitalism, right? So it's the fact that there are already alternatives to the kind of the kind of way of thinking, organizing the earth and all of its living inhabitants that is so extractive, that's leading us to the brink of collapse. So something that's really helpful is that we kind of try to trace through these freedom dreams that the generations before us had gone through, right? Thinking about the ways that anti-colonial struggle, for example, across the African continent and the Caribbean was about land, was about reorganizing the ways that we think about relating to one another, about reorganizing the ways that we actually relate to the land around us, that people have been trying to build new worlds as long as these worlds have been under attack and under assault. So I think that understanding that it has never been a total project, right? The ongoing kind of apocalyptic violences that some of our populations have been experiences, that we have always already been trying to create other ways of organizing the world. And I think that, if we really think about this notion that decolonization as a project of disorder is about disordering a kind of system that for far too many of the world's population, and increasingly all of the world's population, has been really creating a kind of contemporary apocalyptic moment, right? So it's saying we need to have the end of that world in order for the actual planet that we live on and inhabit to thrive. And I think these are some of the ways and the tensions, I think, in terms of what it means to be struggling for freedom in a way that thinks about how we relate to one another, but also how we relate to things on this earth in a non-extractive, in a non-hierarchical way that's not premised in domination.
I'm going to ask you one more question because then I think they have the Simpsons video is ready, because I'm very interested in how you're linking colonization, settler colonialism to extractivism. Do you think this term offers alliances that terms like advanced capitalism, so extractivism, do you think that this term offers alliances or possibilities that advanced capitalism, for example, or crises do not? Or do you think using them coterminously helps with thinking of decolonization as this project of disorder? So I want just to say what the use of the term of extractivism in this sense, because the way you use it, I think is quite interesting.
I mean, I think that the word extractivism is extremely helpful in terms of understanding a particular relationship to the earth, right? Particularly, we know that this was done even in the context of the African continent, right? In terms of places where Europeans were not meant to settle. So there are, particular colonies were set up more so to just be resource extractive colonies that could be all the more destructive because it was not meant to be habitable, right? So we know that extractivism has been intended for the places where Black and Indigenous and other colonized people have lived, but not necessarily those who are assumed to be people, right? Who are for Europeans. So I think that extractivism as a concept allows us to think about the very real and racial colonial histories of pillage and economic and environmental destruction, absolutely. But I do think that maybe it's about thinking about this in terms of, the ways that we're thinking about apocalypse and world ending. I find particularly helpful to have just a bit of a linguistic shift, not away from extractivism, which I think is helpful conceptually, but that just really allows us to think about what the end point of extractivism has led us to, right? Which is really the kinds of IPCC and planetary reports that we're reading that are quite literally describing, what sound like biblical apocalyptic scenes in terms of flooding, in terms of, islands being underwater, right? So I think it really helps us to think about the stakes of what failing to interrupt these kinds of extractivist economies really will do, not only for those of us who, as I described, are first to die, but for this, for all earthly people and for all people living on this planet. So it's trying to hold those two, I think, really importantly and to get together.
Let me now introduce our second speaker, who, as you know, is not here with us, at least but it has shared a video for us to read because circumstances did not enable, and we will have to have both Leanne Simpson and Robyn Maynard, hopefully in Calgary in real time at another occasion. So Leanne Betasamosake Simpson is an Indigenous writer, scholar, artist from Anishinaabe territory, which is actually Treaty 3 and Treaty 9. She has published numerous books of fiction, poetry, nonfiction, including the one that was referenced by Robyn as we have always done, Indigenous freedom through radical resistance. Of course, one of the first I became engaged was Islands of Decolonial Love. And also there's Dancing on Our Turtle's Back. Leanne Simpson is a storyteller, a singer, a poet, a musician. Her work explores themes of indigeneity, feminism, decolonization, land-based education. She's also known for her contributions to the field of Indigenous studies, decolonial studies, for activism, advocacy for the rights of Indigenous people, for dialogues between Indigenous and Black peoples. I think we are fortunate to have her with us and to present this video. So first we'll have Leanne's video, then I will return to be in conversation with Leanne's presentation and that of Robyn Maynard's.
Anin Kinawaya, Gidagabajuna Danawema, Kinagichi Anishinaabe Gogaming Nadonjaba, Nagojawani Megwadoda, Betasamosake, Nadijnakas. Hello, University of Calgary. I'm so happy to be joining you today with Robyn Maynard, and I'm grateful for Malinda's invitation and the flexibility in accommodating my participation via this pre-recorded presentation. And I apologize that I'm not able to be with you in real time. I'm here today to share Rehearsals for Living, which is a book project Robyn and I worked alongside each other, thinking alongside each other, writing alongside each other through the early days of the pandemic and through the global uprising for Black life during the Summer of Revolt in 2020. I'm going to share 2 excerpts from the book today, both from my first letter, and then I will pass things over to Robyn. Robyn, the first thing I underlined in my now worn out copy of your book, Policing Black Lives, was the very first line of the acknowledgement section. Quote, "Writing Policing Black Lives was a community affair, born out of movement work, is geared towards nourishing those same movements that have given me life over the last years." I knew after reading that first line that this book was going to be distinct. Policing Black Lives was written for different reasons than most books published in Canada, reasons that I had profound respect for. Knowledge, research, analysis, and writing born out of movement work and geared towards nourishing, sustaining, and propelling movements for Black life. Robust intellectual work in service of radical Black futurities. Policing Black Lives holds up community and shines a light on the generations of freedom fighters whose individual and collective sacrifices have brought us to this moment. As I read on, I underlined your careful and gentle insistence that Black and Indigenous struggles, while distinct, were also linked. This was significant to me because it gestured towards a more rigorous and nuanced relationality between Black and Indigenous communities, reminiscent of radical Black feminist traditions embodied in so many. Writers like Michaela Silvera, Nurbasi Phillip, Dion Brand, and Afia Cooper. In Policing Black Lives, you were the first one to gather together the work of Black feminists and organizers and provide us with a volcano of meticulously researched evidence that destroyed Canadian innocence and exceptionalism with regards to transatlantic slavery and anti-Blackness. In Policing Black Lives, you taught me abolition on stolen land is the practice of caring. My book, As We Have Always Done, came out the same year as your Policing Black Lives. I remember wishing your book had come first because it would have made As We Have Always Done more complete and rigorous. I would have brought Policing Black Lives into conversation with the chapters in As We Have Always Done, and from an Indigenous perspective, pointed towards the same robust and nuanced relationality between Indigenous and Black communities you had done in Policing Black Lives, albeit from my own Anishinaabe perspective. When an occasion presented itself to launch As We Have Always Done in Jajaga, in Ganagihaga territory where you were living at the time, I wanted to invite you into a conversation, a thinking through between ourselves and our books. You graciously accepted the invitation, and our conversation took place on April 14th, 2018. This was the very first time we had met in person. I remember the Black community of Montreal showing up in power at the event. I remember being very nervous, as one should be when their first encounter with someone is on a stage with a mic in front of a beautiful, articulate, intelligent audience. I remember your pink lipstick. I remember my Blistex. I remember being painfully aware that I was dressed like I was from Ontario. I can't remember very much about what we talked about, but we obviously had the sense to record it because there is an edited transcript of part of our conversation in Until We Are Free, Reflections on Black Lives Matter in Canada. This was our first visit. Roughly a year later, in 2019, as part of my work at the Ditchinta Center for Research and Learning in Benende, I helped conceptualize, organize, and actualize a solidarity gathering that took place in March in the territory of the Yellowknives Dene First Nation. Our idea was simple: to invite a small group of Black, Brown, and Indigenous activists, thinkers, writers, and organizers to spend time with us in the spring on an island in what the Yellowknives Dene know as Tinde, or Big Lake. Together, we fished nets under the ice, traveled by snowmobile and sleigh across the frozen lake, shared moose ribs cooked over the fire, stories from YKDFN elders, our own ideas, and time with each other. We wanted to invest in our relationship with each other and our affinities outside of the institution, the internet, and crisis, because we believed that the land would pull out a different set of conversations and gift us with a different way of relating. We wanted to sit together on the land, immersed in a Dene world, engaged in a practice of Dene hospitality, to see if we related to each other in a different way. This is exactly what happened. The land nurtured a set of conversations and way of relating to each other outside of the institution and its formations. I remember you and I eating muskox around the fire, talking about how different eating muskox around a fire in the bush was from meeting in a hallway or a bar at a conference or interacting online. We were also meeting, and there was no crisis or blockade or protest or agenda. We were coming together to nourish each other, to relate to each other, to listen and share, and to breathe together, to use Norbesi Phillips' thinking. I could intellectualize about the experience and speak in terms of relationality and relationship building, something I think Black and Indigenous activists in the 1960s and 1970s understood far better than us. I could talk about this from an Indigenous methodological angle, with visiting and developing relationships of trust as foundational to any exchange of knowledge and experience. I could write about the spiritual dimension of this work, again from Indigenous perspectives, being surrounded by trees, medicines, air, sky, and water. In a sense, though, none of that particularly matters, other than to say, I think land-based politics grounded in a sustained and nurturing relationship with the natural world and in protecting nature as a means of protecting ourselves can be one generative means of nourishing Black and Indigenous politics of solidarity. Our starting point was simple, that land and placemaking, although perhaps different, were and remain important to both Black and Indigenous peoples. Our starting point was a refusal of the nation state and the racial capitalism, white supremacy, and heteropatriarchy embodied in those structures. Our starting point was a recognition that transatlantic slavery, and as Saideya Hartman says, its afterlives, and colonialism mean that we have distinctive and intertwined histories, presence, and distinctive and intertwined theory and world-making practices. We imagined the synergistic potential of Black land politics and Indigenous land politics towards liberated lands and bodies. After that gathering, the possibilities to continue this work seemed endless. Trips to the Sugar Bush, hikes in downtown Toronto, exchanges between our freedom schools, gatherings in the Caribbean, and then the pandemic hit. Our lives shrunk into our home spaces during stay-at-home orders. There was an urgency in addressing the pandemic under white supremacy because we knew that Black, Brown, and Indigenous people are always the first to die, and that any state solutions will be made to first save white people's lives and livelihoods. Zoom seemed like the last place we wanted to continue this work. In fact, to me, it felt like virtual environments were antithetical to this work. And so you and I decided to write each other letters because we couldn't see each other in person. As an honored radical Black feminist methodology of scaffolding the intimate and personal within the global, letter writing made sense. We decided to not only write what we know, but to attempt to think through things together, to generate through this intentional relationship a sort of study of Black and Indigenous relationality through the study of our own responsive relationality. In hindsight, and after reading Catherine McKittrick's Dear Science, each of us drew on our distinctive, quote, rebellious methodologies, end quote, in this project. For you, Black theory, story, knowledge, and methodologies of knowledge production. And for me, Anishinaabe story is theory, knowledge, and methodologies of knowledge production. The intersection was friendship, collaboration, song, story, movement work, citations, analytics, and oral practice. The interstitial spaces are this project. We made a commitment to each other to think alongside each other through the chaos of the global COVID-19 pandemic, through the ongoing pandemic of Black and Indigenous death and erasure, and through the beautiful revolutions of Black and Indigenous organizing and resistance. We agreed to be first and foremost empathetic, responsible, and gentle with each other, which required a trust and a vulnerability that for me was new and intellectual work. We did not shy away from the issues and tensions between our two communities. What began as a series of letters with footnotes between us has grown into something that has expanded outside of the two of us and then grown again into Rehearsals for Living. This book is a chronicle of our thinking in a particular moment of time. It's messy, it's incomplete, it's gentle. It is, in its simplest form, a record of our relationality. The recording of this record required a divestment of the arrogance of the expert in favor of openness, intimacy, care, and humility. And so these are also songs that chronicle our love and friendship. And like making a record, listening became perhaps the most important methodology. You are a fully formed thinker, writer, and researcher, not because of your credentials of the academy, but because of your practice, your ethics, and your bodies of work. You are steeped in an extensive network of movement and organizing experience in Black systems of knowledge production, analysis, and theory making, in addition to the written work of Black and anti-colonial scholars. Robyn Maynard, I have learned so very much from you and those formations of young Black activists on our streets, bringing forth new worlds before our very eyes. There are many Indigenous and Black peoples that have done and are doing the same kind of thinking in the academy and outside on the streets and in encampments, in prisons, around kitchen tables, and in the bush. We are centering Indigenous and Black life and lives because we are Anishinaabe and Black, not because we don't value our relationships and solidarity with anti-colonial, racialized peoples in Canada and beyond. Wewene, we will go carefully. So that's an excerpt from my first letter in response to the letter that Robyn wrote me. And the second piece is how I end that first letter. And it's called Civil Twilight. In the 1930s, my grandmother Audrey was a 10-year-old Anishinaabe Kwai living on Wolfe Street in Peterborough, Ontario, having recently moved into town from the reserve, but still spending glorious summers on the lake in her home community of Alderville First Nation. Her father and my great-grandfather, Hartley Franklin, most often a fishing guide on Rice Lake, had found more stable employment building canoes for the Peterborough Canoe Company, necessary in part because of the loss of hunting and fishing rights in the wake of the fraudulent Williams Treaties of 1923. The life he created in itself was a feat, an intact Michi-Sagi Anishinaabe family with children in the home, living on our homeland with food and shelter. But the calm would not last. A decade before the discovery of antibiotics, Hartley contracted tuberculosis and was quarantined in a sanatorium more than 200 kilometers away in Kitchener. Audrey, her mother, and little brother moved to Galt to be closer to him. When Audrey's mama, Agnes, also got TB, my grandmother and her brother were apprehended into foster care with white families. Hartley eventually died in the sanitarium when my grandmother was 14. She remembers standing by his casket in Grandma Ida Smoke's living room on the reserve in Alderville while her mom was fighting for her life in the sanatorium. 2 years later, Angus recovered, but my grandma was forced to quit school when their living allowance was cut off. She got a job at Galt Wood Heel, gluing heels onto shoes for 10 hours a day. In the span of a decade, my family went from living on the reserve, immersed in Anishinaabe life and community, to being alone with grief in a city several hundred kilometers away. Tuberculosis succeeded in removing my family from our territory, away from our land, family, culture, and language, and pushed us further into the wage economy, meeting Canada's political goals of eliminating Indigenous people through either death or assimilation. I live a few blocks away from the house my grandmother lived in as a child in Peterborough. Every night at 8 o'clock, my daughter Minaway and I run through our neighborhood. The streets are quiet. Min likes the color of the sky at civil twilight. She practices her vertical leap by attempting to high-five a giant white pine. I think about how each week she gets faster and faster while I stay the same. By the time we're back at our house, away from the motion detecting lights of our neighbors, we can see the first stars. She points them out and names them while I just listen, which I now realize is always the most important job. A strong part of me wants to use these half-hour runs to lecture my captive audience of one. I want Min to carry within her body a sharp knife. I want to assign her Robyn Maynard, Andrea Ritchie, and Al Jones's recent writings on COVID-19 in the dominating structure of anti-Blackness, and then discuss them on our nightly run. I want to talk to her about communities like Grassy Narrows and how they will face COVID-19 with all the same challenges as other remote First Nations, food insecurity, lack of adequate housing and healthcare, and the endless fumbling bureaucracy of Indigenous service agencies in places where community members already have compromised health from mercury poisoning in the 1970s, TB exposure in residential schools, and a host of other chronic colonially induced disease. I want her to know the situation for urban Indigenous peoples is challenging in a different way under COVID-19. Our families too experience high rates of housing and food insecurity, but also police surveillance and violence, incarceration, intimate partner violence, substance use, and street-affected realities. And for our gender non-conforming, non-binary, and trans relations, navigating a mostly hostile medical system committed to the gender binary and transphobia. I want her to know that for Prairie, First Nations, and Métis peoples, the death-making machine of white racism has already intensified during the pandemic. On the first day of April, Calgary police charged a man for uttering death threats when he said he would intentionally spread COVID-19 to Indigenous peoples. On April 2nd, RCMP arrested a suspect in the murder of two Métis men, Jake Sampson and Maurice Cardinal, who were out hunting to feed their family. And on April 9th, 16-year-old Aisha Hudson was shot and killed by Winnipeg police. I want her to know that the oil and gas industry has continued to endanger Indigenous people in Wet'suwet'en homelands by continuing to work along the pipeline route and housing hundreds of workers in man camps. I want her to know that we and everyone we love are more vulnerable because of colonialism, and in crises, vulnerabilities are amplified. I want her to know that we are not in this together. The empty streets of our neighborhood under social distancing and stay-at-home orders remind me of the loneliness Hartley Franklin must have felt, quarantined in an institution for years, far from everything Anishinaabe and all of his loves. I wonder if he would feel the same relief I do watching Min harvesting wild rice, or splitting spruce roots for a canoe, or standing in traffic in solidarity with the Wet'suwet'en, or running with the stars through the neighborhood where he brought his family in the precious moments before Anishinaabe life was stolen. I wonder if he could still find meaning in twilight or stars or in the frozen lake of grief that inevitably blanketed him. Minaway is living through the pandemic at the same age my grandmother was when she lost her dad to epidemic tuberculosis. She is teaching me not to crush her joy. On our nightly run, she demands I stay in the moment, breathe in sharp air, and listen for the drumming of our shoes on the cement against the rhythm of our breathing. She reminds me to look forward to the crew at the end of the street that meticulously chalks Scooby-Doo characters onto their sidewalk each day, to not aimlessly veer into traffic when I see another human on the sidewalk, and to maybe even practice my vertical jump too. Each night, Minawewe Beneshi pulls me out of myself and insists I remember that running through inky bruises, seeking light from the moon and beside someone you love is one of the best parts of this life. She reminds me that maybe if you are a 14-year-old Anishinaabe Kwe and you can find the will to reach up to our tree of peace, you don't always need the lecture and the sharp knife. Maybe you've already beaten COVID-19 and are in the midst of dreaming beyond colonialism. Miigwech for listening. I hope you have an amazing conversation, and I'm going to pass things over to Robyn now.
I want to thank Leanne Simpson for that moving and powerful presentation. And what I'd like to do, Robyn, is actually begin with a word that was used by both you and Leanne in your presentation, which is this word of vulnerability. Both you and Leanne refer to this question of vulnerability. I mean, we think about vulnerability, we think about, you know, the ways in which people who are activists, people who are renowned, are concerned about harm physically or emotionally. They think about not wanting to take risk, not wanting to share. And I'm actually asking this question in an environment, a virtual environment, where whether it's social media or otherwise, where there is a lot of conversations about emotive conversations around activists. So the question is, that's one side of the question I want to ask you, that experience of being comfortable with vulnerability in a way that allowed you to have these kinds of risky, if you will, risky conversation, but it's risk in a different way from people think of risk. It's a risk in being able to be open in order to think a world otherwise. So I wonder when you could say a little bit about this vulnerability and that kind of risk taking that allowed you to continue these conversations, and how you dealt with that, you know, in this virtual remote environment, building relationality in those terms.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that question. I think that's sort of one of the ongoing questions of feminist thought and struggle in particular that really, I think, as a theory of change, really asks us to contend with vulnerability, maybe in the most well-articulated way. So I think that because originally Rehearsals for Living was not intended as a book, and I think that actually allowed it to have a certain kind of vulnerability, because it really was one, you know, person. It was me writing Leanne, who I respected very much as a friend, as an intellectual, as a co-thinker, was not particularly close with yet, though we'd had, as she describes in her letter, these moments where we'd really begun to start to think together about what freedom might mean. But the letter format is something that is so different than an academic conference paper. The letter format is something that is so different than even writing sort of a formal chapter or article, given that we didn't even sit down together to map out what might we want to do, right? So it's something that really was born and evolved over and across the time of really writing one another. At one point, you know, it's perhaps even only because of the pandemic that it ended up actually being a book in this way, that it ended up being letters as opposed to maybe just conversations that we may or may not have recorded, right? Because it was the way of thinking together once the world had shut down in these other ways, and we didn't really want Zoom to be the way to have that conversation. We wanted that time to think and reflect. And I think that because of that, the very personal nature of the letters, while we're thinking about world historical processes like slavery, colonialism, you know, ecological violence, at the same time that we're really parenting our children, bringing our children to protest, trying to, you know, the personal and political in that way can really weave into one in a way that's seamless, that would be difficult to do in another medium. So I think that ended up being captured because of the format. And we interestingly had this conversation once we had decided it would be a book. You know, much later, we were wondering if we should take out those more personal aspects, those more vulnerable aspects, and make it more of just a book of essays, right? And we decided, and we are trying to decide back and forth, because it is quite vulnerable in these many ways. But what I think for me, what pushed me over the edge was revisiting Audre Lorde, as I often do for anybody who knows me well, and thinking about her insistence that we maintain, the erotic, that we sit with our fear, that there's all these aspects in terms of our creative worlds that we actually need to center and not shy away from. And I think that was for me something that really helped make the decision for me that we actually should put it out in this format. I think that at the same time as we wanted it to remain vulnerable, and I think so much the text is about and asking one another questions and thinking together more than it's about particular, iterating particular demands or statements, right? And that's something that it was very collective in the way that it was written in that way, not only thinking with each other, but with movements. But we did also want it to be very accountable, first and foremost to one another, but also to the communities, of organizers, the bigger, broader communities that we're part of as scholars, and internationally, right, in terms of just thinking about not wanting to ever do harm with a kind of text. So I think there's always that check where we're always trying to make sure that the text is in good relation, but thinking through the idea that perhaps we didn't have to have a definitive text with a set of defined conclusions is something that allowed the text to be, I think, the kind of questioning and thinking with that people might experience as when they're reading it with us, which is really a part of being alongside us as we're meandering through the many possible timelines that could possibly take us to different liberatory futures. So the vulnerability ended up being, I think, the way that let us actually approach so many issues that would have actually been quite difficult, I think, to address within the context of an essay or a more formal sort of academic book, for example.
So in listening to you in this journey that you on, there are lots of vulnerabilities, risk-taking that you were engaging on with this, people refer to as genre-defying work. And that's fine. But I also want to ask you a question about this, because I think it's actually this work that you have done is really helpful indirectly, but directly, for the way you're thinking about community and relationships. And what if you took a traditional format to a dialogue or conversation or writing a book, you might start saying, what are Black Indigenous relationships like, and how do we deal with it, and why are there tensions? And so yet you answer ways of entering those conversations without making it scary, if you will. You actually grapple with challenging issues. But I want to ask you this question, because in having these conversations, you didn't really know each other that well, which is extraordinary, well known internationally, and you're having this conversation, but you're building trust and you're building relationships and you're doing it virtually and remotely, generating some respect. Conceivably, you must have had disagreements. And so I'm interested in how thinking together, thinking alongside, thinking about, you're not just having an individualized conversation, you're thinking about movements and collectives and what weaving in these as part of how you're having this conversation. How did you navigate that? And if you had disagreements, how did you navigate that? Did you come in through it? How did you enter those conversations in a way that you could disagree without being disagreeable, if you will, and continue the love, the decolonial love, to continue imagining a world otherwise?
Oh, I really like this question. Thank you. So I think that something that you're pointing out, which is that rootedness in love and community, I think is really what was at the base of the project. We weren't setting out, for example, to have a debate, and we weren't setting out, for example, for one competing vision to win. The project was always, even before we knew that we would write one another letters, that I think when we met, which as Leanne described, is really on the stage of this Montreal event, really, I think we committed immediately to wanting to co-think about what freedom might mean for our own communities, for one another's communities, to think expansively and generously and with humility. So I would say that, the letters, sometimes they would be slow, it would be a long gap before a letter would be returned, because I think, again, the format really allowed for a certain kind of, there's a lack of defensiveness that comes in if you first encounter something and you have to think about it, but then, you take your time, over the course of several weeks, you keep reading, both of us, we always laugh at ourselves because we're very much nerds in the way that our letter writing, there's like 70 footnotes per letter, which is very us, but, so you have to really engage. It ends up being encyclopedic in terms of what you're being asked to think with. And I think that in a lot of ways, perhaps we were challenging one another, but those kinds of challenges allowed us to think differently. So if I can think about a really tangible example, I remember, so there's a letter that I wrote Leanne, my third letter called A Summer of Revolt, that's very much thinking in real time with the kind of demonstrations that were happening in the summer of 2020 against policing, thinking about abolitionist futures and worlds without carceral violence. And in response, her letter is really thinking about, yes, and what about the question of land? How does this fit in? And she's not saying no, right? She's very much in support and being so, I think also, getting so much from these movements that were happening in support of Black life, but really, I think pushing me generously to really think about land. And the letter that I end up writing her back is called "We Are People of the Lands, More the Lands Than Had Ever Been Counted." And it's something that I don't know if I would have written if she hadn't actually pushed me to really address those issues. In her very gentle but very brilliant response, where she's laying out, of course, the history of policing in Canada as being intrinsically part of a project of land theft and genocide. And that's something that really got me to thinking about the relationship between, colonial policing in the African continent, for example, which was also about land theft, right? So thinking about abolition in a larger context, in a process that's about Indigenous land, Black people's relationship with land as well. And that's something that could only really come from this dialogic way, again, of thinking, because I think even just in a live conversation, I'm not sure how, there's no way that I would have been able to elaborate to think for so long before responding and really end up coming back with this sort of way, a deeper engagement with the question, for example, of the way that I think about the relationship between policing and land, having to expand on that because of a gentle interjection from a friend, right? So I think that that's something, the ways that kind of relationship developed really let us be our best for one another, to try to be as rigorous, but also, really basing it again, always in a kind of expansive, freedom-oriented and care-oriented projects, right? That would do no harm between one another's communities or in the world. That would, really be about looking at what it means to build and to build together, and to really keep that at the center of what you're trying to do, I think makes for a certain kind of practice, that has to be embedded in a practice of care.
I really appreciate that answer, but I also appreciate, I must say, and I just need this to be said, that, if we look at the ways in which people tell stories about you and Leanne, and because it's the academic environment, you're both academics, you both are concerned about decolonization, land base, and you both have these larger than life-size reputation, and yet you are very humble. The humility is extraordinary. It is notable, and I want to say it's notable because typically this kind of reputation leads people to take on different ways of engaging. So I deeply appreciate this generous approach, but also recognizing that a tweet is not sufficient to think through with care and love the way you engage in order to be different, but to imagine a world otherwise. And so one of the questions that the audience have when I made this paper is whether you think how the pandemic paradoxically enabled that kind of, and remote enabled that kind of engagement, or do you think you would have had this email communication, not email, but you would have had this letter writing approach were it not for the pandemic? So there was a paradox to this pandemic of creating the space, if you will, for you to have this kind of engagement, this with humility, but also generosity, but also showing the way forward in terms of how you think together, carefully, thoughtfully, with community, with this body of knowledge that you can draw upon and share.
Yeah, it's really hard to know what might have happened to this project had there not been stay-at-home orders, had we had so many plans. We were excited to think together, and we had all these different ideas going to what it would be like to go to the Caribbean and think about land and those real lived histories of genocide and slavery that are there. My family's from Barbados, right? What it might mean to go back to the north, to go to the sugar bush, maple syrup. We had all these ideas on which the ways that place were actually going to center these conversations that ended up in a stay-at-home orders period being very impossible, but nonetheless, the work traveled, right? And the ideas traveled. And I don't know it's hard to imagine what may have come otherwise, because there was a lot of things that made it such that this ended up being a book that was shared with others, that was not just, an interesting correspondence between two people who were thinking together, including, for example, the support of Dion Brand, who really encouraged us to say that this is a book when we were thinking about it as who knows, right? As a zine, like we just knew that we were really interested in the conversation. So we were pushed to make it publicly available, but it could have been any other things, but for the pandemic, but for that particular time that I went out for lunch, right? So I think it's impossible really to know, but I do think that we also, when we decided to think together, we didn't think we were going to live through that very revolutionary moment of 2020, when there were historic protests across Canada, across the United States, of people outside on the street for months demanding quite literally a new world, right? I think that we lived through a time that we never could have foreseen, and it feels hard to access that energy and momentum now, but I think it's really important to understand how many people were rejecting the contemporary world order at that time, that we were seeing so visibly, the logic of who lives and dies in a pandemic, of who's made disposable at the hands of police, at the hands of, state actors determining who has access to vaccines and all of this. And I think that it forced a kind of confrontation with the status quo across this country, across North America, globally. We saw in Nigeria with the End SARS movement, right? So there's so much, we never could have imagined living through, I think, a reckoning of what's called a reckoning now of that moment either. And of course, that ended up changing the way that we were writing. It's one thing to be thinking about the possibility of something, and it's another thing to be sitting and writing a letter when, outside down at the police station, when you're literally taking calls from lawyers to try to get people out, who've been arrested in the context of a really lived struggle against policing and a struggle for Black life, right? So, I just think that there were so many unforeseen things that were happening in those months prior to when we started to think about this, that of course shaped enormously what ended up being the book Rehearsals for Living, that, could very well have just been many unrecorded conversations between two people, but such that so many things occurred at the same time that I think ended up helping us commit to this version of what it meant to think together, which fortunately was recorded and was able to be published in this form. But the book is very much about timelines of otherwise and what may else have happened, right? So I think that's something that I think about continually. So we don't know what the other timelines of Rehearsals may have actually been in different contexts as well.
Well, I'm hoping that I can have you both back, perhaps in person, to have a conversation, including to talk about those, 2020, the uprisings, all of the illustrative examples that you give in the letters that speak to moments that institutions themselves, like university, responded to, and to reflect on where we are now, 2 years later, whether in fact we have seen the kind of transformation that had been envisioned, the racial reckoning. So I hope that we can do that. But I just want to end with this comment from one of the comments about how the appreciation for those thought-provoking letters, the meaningful content, purposeful, but also how it highlights courage. In the sense that Maya Angelou talks about, right? You have to unravel the truths. So bravo to both of you. In sum, I just really want to thank you for being here with us. And I want to thank Leanne. I know she's here with us in spirit. I want to thank her for even thinking the thought of sharing a video, which is so typical of her generosity and insightfulness. I want to put and the insights there. So thank you, Leanne. And I know everyone out there who were here previously and who have had to leave want to offer their thanks as well, with much appreciation. So I want to say now in wrapping up that this discussion has been, that Courageous Conversation was envisioned as tackling difficult, important, transformational conversations that are needed in the academy, perhaps that are not often associated with offices of equity, diversity, and inclusion, speaking truth to power, when the power that may be critiqued are our own offices. So I'm mindful of that, and I think it is important, and your book helps me to think about why I need to keep reading like this, and why I need to keep engaging with activists and movements, so that we don't become comfortable, so that we become so we learn to continue to be uncomfortable in ways that helps us to generate the necessary conditions for change, the necessary conversations for change. So I appreciate that. I appreciate you accepting the invitation, because I know some would not accept an invitation from an EDI office. Let's not have any illusions about this, for precisely this kind of reason. But it also reminds us that we remain the intellectuals, the activists, or we aspire to, that we want to be. I invite each of you who are here to go to our website, ucalgary.ca/equity-diversity-inclusion, and look for the link for Courageous Conversations, where you will have, you will see all the prior speakers. You will also see there were lots of resources that are shared as well. You'll also see the EDI week events that are coming February 6th to 10th, workshops and lectures where we continue to have courageous conversations, where we continue to try to push the boundaries and to imagine and to construct and to be different, but to imagine a world otherwise, but also how we go about enacting that. And I think Rehearsals for Living, and the storytelling that we started with Elder Colleen Sitting Eagle set us up well for thinking about all of those. Thank you to all of the panelists, to all of the wisdom of the people who were in the audience, your questions, your insight, your participation. We hope to see you again for the next Courageous Conversation. Please send more virtual love to our speaker, and we look forward to seeing you again. Robyn, Maynard, I treasure every moment I have the opportunity to engage with you. I thank you and Leanne Simpson for this opportunity to engage, and I look forward to further engagement. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us, for inviting us, for all of your work and vision. And thank you so much, everybody, for attending and spending these hours with us.
Thank you.